Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I have on Jake Remmert. I might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but he will definitely correct me if I'm wrong there. But he recently authored a study titled Accuracy of Predicted Intraset Repetitions in Reserve in Single and Multi-Joint Resistance Exercises among trained and untrained men and women. And that's going to be the topic of discussion today. But first off, Jake, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, man.
Yeah, so I think a good place for us to start here is what kind of led you to even wanting to do this study in the first place?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting, right? Because I was in my undergrad when I did this. So I knew I was kind of weird. Like before I even started going to college, I knew I wanted to do a PhD. And so I was like, okay, how can I make my resume as good as possible, right? So I was doing, they called it an independent study at the university I was at. But basically, you're just kind of helping out in the lab and you get some school credit for it and stuff. And it was super fun. I loved it. And I was like, man, I want to do more. And then me as the slightly arrogant and just not knowing undergrad student, I was like, I want to do my own study, right? So I found the professor who ran the lab and I was like, is this possible? Like, I would love to do this. And he was like, well, what's your idea? And I explained to him, what I wanted to do. And he let me do it. So that was amazing. So that was a big reason why, right? Is I just wanted to get my hands in there and do something. And also not really knowing how research works, I was like, I want to have a published paper before I even start grad school, not knowing it's now been 4 years, like since we finished it, right? So that's how it goes. But so that was a big reason, just wanting to get in there and do something. But then the reason why we did this specific thing was one, feasibility. Like I didn't have much time to collect the data. I didn't have any help. I did all the data collection myself. So it had to be an acute thing and something that, subjects would just come in, do the protocol and then leave and that sort of thing. And then some of it also was like this area of research just had some holes in it that I thought would be, pretty low hanging fruit, right? Pretty easy to test. One being that, there was no single joint exercises involved. At the time, everybody had just done squat, bench press, leg press, chest press. One study did a seal row. There's one study from our lab that's not published yet that did a deadlift, but that was it, right? No single joint stuff. So I wanted to do that and then also have a multi-joint thing in there so we could compare them. And then also do, add more data to female subjects, which there's just not a ton in exercise science. It's getting better, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. And also untrained people and, looking at the methods that we collect the data with, right? Like, so in this area, a lot of the studies, there's some studies from Hackett et al. that they usually do. They would do 10 reps, pause, rate their RIR, and then continue to failure. So they just get one rating. Other studies, like from our lab here, what they would do is they would have them call out like a predetermined RIR. So they would say, you're going to do the set to failure, and when you think you have 5 RIR, say that. When you think you have 3 RIR, say that, and so on. So really people are limited. They've had just one call or they'd have 2 or 3 in some of the papers from our lab and others, but no one had ever done anything quite like what we did, which was like a rep by rep type of thing. Because I was just, to me, in the gym, we're not limited to just one guess, right? Like we can kind of feel it out rep to rep and let that kind of guide the way. So I wanted to find some way to test that. So that's what made us end up here.
Awesome. And I like that you mentioned like some of the practical sides of data collection and doing a study, as you'll get a lot of people online, like a study is published and then they'll come out and be like, oh, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do this? And why isn't there just these like, 30-week studies on these different training programs? Like, dude, you have no idea what it's like.
Man, there's so much that you don't know until you're actually in there doing it, right? And I don't want that to sound any kind of weird way, but like when I first got into a lab and started doing stuff, I was like, oh,
yeah,
now I get it, right? Like we're constrained to the school semester. Like, so there's certain time lengths that we can't really exceed. Like there's just so much little stuff you don't think about.
I totally agree. So for my master's thesis, we did a similar thing to where we kind of did our own studies for that. We didn't necessarily need to go through the steps of actually getting them published and stuff, which for me, wanting to just graduate on time, I didn't go through that process. But with that, it does definitely make you understand that like, wow, you are totally limited. by semester, by certain like even things as small as like spring break kind of influencing your data
Yeah,
collection, or even like, if you did a nutrition study, trying to get college students to restrict their nutrition to a certain type of way, it's like a headache and a half. So there's a
that's
ton of
tough,
issues
man.
with it. So hopefully people gain a little bit of understanding there of like what you go to do it, and you kind of see how the sausage is made, so to speak. You
Yep,
get a different perspective on why certain studies are done in certain ways.
for sure, for sure.
Cool, man. Well, I think that kind of leads us well into kind of what did you guys do for this study? What were kind of the methods? How did you kind of decide to collect the data for your study, and what did you guys kind of decide to do here?
So basically, I'm going to try to say this in the most succinct way possible, but there was three exercises we did, right? We did bicep curl, tricep push down, and seated cable row. That way we were, again, limitations. We only had so much equipment in the lab, right? So ideally I would have loved to do like leg press and leg extension or something like that, right? But we just didn't have the the equipment. So we did the best we could with what we had, and we had a nice cable machine we were able to kind of use for various things. So we had those three exercises again. That way we could compare single and multi joint, because I certainly feel this way anecdotally. I'm sure a lot of people, your listeners, and probably experienced this, that like it seems a little bit easier to judge your RIR on like a bicep curl compared to a squat, for example, right? Like it's just, I don't know. So I wanted to look at that a little bit. So those are our exercises, and what we would do is those were done in randomized order for each participant, and they would come in, and of course we'd do the informed consent and paperwork and all that kind of stuff, get some anthropometrics, etc. But once we actually got started, it would be general warm up, and then for whichever exercise was first, we would do a specific warm up for that. Just various sets, getting heavier and heavier, and get to the point where we tested a 5 rep max. And then from that, we could estimate 1 rep max. And the reason, again, makes sense once you actually do it. Not super safe to do a 1 RM on a bicep curl or a tricep push down, right? So, and a lot of untrained people get scared about, 5 RM's already kind of scary, So anyway, so that's what we did. We estimated 1 RM and then took a percentage of that to get the load for the first set. And again, that kind of stuff is just to standardize the loading and try to get us into a certain rep range. I wanted to do, because of the exercises, I wanted like a moderate to, I guess you could call it high rep. It was like 12 to 20 reps was sort of the range we were shooting for, set to set. So we did some pilot testing beforehand, and we found that around 72.5%, as specific and weird as that sounds, was great to kind of land us in there for most people. And so that's what we did to get the load for the first set. And they ended up doing 4 total sets. And if they were outside the rep range on any given set, then we would adjust the weight accordingly. We had like a certain percentage load increase or decrease based on how many reps outside the range they were in either direction. So that was sort of the trying to control for that kind of stuff, rep range and whatnot. And each set was taken to failure. And along the way, this was sort of the different piece that we layered in here, was when they first felt that they had 5 RIR, they would say 5. Just immediately after the rep, they would just say 5. And then from that point on, after every single rep, they would take, just half a second and tell me how many RIR they thought they had. So, theoretically, perfect accuracy would then be they would essentially count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and then fail the next one. Would be, theoretically perfect accuracy. Obviously, not everybody had that, right? It actually happened more often than I would have expected. But a lot of people, they would say 5 multiple times, or they would whatever, right? So then once we had all that, that was really all the data collection process, right? It was pretty simple. And then the rest of the work was just on me, sort of, we could see what rep they failed at, count backwards from there, and sort of retroactively assess the accuracy of each of those predictions that they made. And then, we would use that in the statistical analysis to figure out what was going on. So we looked at all kinds of differences, right? Like the stuff that's been looked at before, we did that. So that was basically, does the accuracy change as you get closer to failure? Does the accuracy change as you do multiple sets? Are there differences based on sex? Are there differences based on the exercise we did? Are there differences based on training experience? Based on, do you have experience using RIR? And what was the other one? We called it the initial In the paper, it's called RIR diff, like RIR difference, just to be sort of succinct for the paper, but it's essentially just the error in the ratings, right? And the initial error is the first time they said 5. How far off were they? Just that initial guess that they had. And we use that as well to kind of see, is that related to the accuracy at all? So I know that's kind of a lot. Did that make sense? Did I say anything confusing?
No, I think that was perfect. I think that sets things up really well. Maybe one follow up question I have is you kind of mentioned that you had both trained and untrained individuals and you kind of looked at the difference between those. So I would just be curious on how you guys quantified like trained. What did you guys kind of say was a more trained individual? Was it just like, I know some studies will be like they were recreationally active at least 3 times a week, or how did you guys kind of quantify that?
During the initial, like when they were doing their paperwork and stuff, we got informed consent, and then they filled out this thing and this paperwork to get like training experience and do you have experience with RIR, et cetera. So we got how many months of training experience do you have? Without any kind of extended break in the middle, right? Like if you didn't train for 6 months, then your training time kind of starts after that point or whatever when you pick it back up. So then we had that. And then what we did is we took people and sort of broke them into like 3 separate buckets, if you will, right? There was just untrained people. There was people with just a little bit of experience, which it's in the paper. I can't remember the exact number of months how we broke it up. I want to say it was, I can't remember. And then the more trained people were people with more than I think 60 months, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
It was quite a bit. They're surprisingly highly trained, some of these people. Not all of them, of course, obviously, but anyway, so we kind of split them into these 3 different categories of experience and analyzed it that way.
Gotcha. Cool. I think that's the only kind of follow up question I had regarding your guys' method. So I think now it's time to kind of get into the good stuff. What were some of the key things that you guys kind of found here?
Yeah. So some of it, I guess it's easy to break it down in like what accuracy was impacted by versus what it was not impacted by. So what it was impacted by would be how close to failure you are, right? So, which makes sense. The closer you are to failure, the easier it is to judge. We've seen that in a bunch of the prior studies. So we found that. We found that accuracy was better in later sets compared to early sets, which again, makes sense. You have recent prior experience to base those ratings off of in the set you're currently doing. And again, we've seen that in prior studies. And then we also saw that initial guess that people had was also related to their RIR accuracy, meaning that the more accurate that initial guess was, the more accurate people tended to be in general, which again makes sense, right? None of those things are surprising. What was a little bit surprising was some of the stuff that it was not impacted by, which was everything else, right? So no impact of sex, which isn't super surprising, I guess, right? There's no reason to just inherently believe that. Training experience was not a factor there. The experience using RIR was not a factor. The exercise being performed was not a factor. So interesting. Some of that stuff is not what I expected at all. Some of it was, but it's I think some of it is explained a bit by like people were just pretty accurate in general. We have a table in the paper that showed like at actual 5 RIR all the way down to failure, kind of shows the average, like the mean accuracy at each of those points. And even when they're actually 5 reps away, I think the average was like 1.2 reps away, like from perfect accuracy, right? So it's pretty good. It's actually better than what a lot of the papers have shown that far away from failure. So I think that's definitely a factor, right? Like if accuracy wasn't as good in general, we might have seen some other differences.
Yeah.
But, a lot of it just comes out in the wash when things are pretty close together.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And it also doesn't match my expectations of what I figured would happen, which kind of leads me into a follow-up question. What did you kind of expect those results to be? And what were kind of some of those key differences that were kind of like, oh, I didn't really kind of expect that to happen?
Yeah. The first one, like part of why I wanted to do the study in the first place was comparing single and multi-joint stuff, right? Just in the gym, it just feels easier to tell in single joint. And it just wasn't the case, which again, maybe is just because people were pretty accurate in general. And maybe it was because they were all upper body, right? Some of the studies that have looked at different exercises, it's like a chest press and leg press, So there's an argument, maybe it's just different exercises, but you could also argue maybe it's total size of muscle mass that's involved in the lift. Because I think we can all imagine taking a set of leg press to failure is a lot more miserable than a set of chest press to failure, right? Everything hurts. It's hard to tell your RIR just because it's miserable. So that could be why. So that's how I've sort of rationalized that one or explained it, and at least to myself. But so I think that one kind of makes sense. The training experience one is interesting. Again, a lot of us would probably guess that more trained people or people who have more experience using RIR specifically would have been better.
That's what surprised me probably most, was the
Yep.
people that had experience training RIR didn't actually perform better at rating it. That was
Yeah,
pretty crazy.
it is. And I guess I have a couple thoughts on that. One is that we've actually seen that before. There's a paper from our lab it got published 2021, I think, that also looked at that, and they found no impact of it, which is still interesting. But I'm like, maybe a couple things. One, if everyone's pretty accurate anyway, makes sense. We wouldn't see a difference. And then two, the people who have used it before, if they're not as accurate and everyone's just kind of inaccurate, like in that study, they had higher errors than we found. So that could also be a thing. But it's definitely interesting. And the training experience one is like, I looked at this extensively. Like, this was my master's thesis also, right? Was looking at like long-term changes in RIR accuracy, like in a longitudinal study, because that had also never been done up to that point. And I guess I'll spoil it. We didn't find any differences, right? Like it was weird. But again, people were just accurate the whole time. So, but anyway, going into this paper, I hadn't done my thesis yet, and there was a couple studies at the time that kind of hinted that maybe experience could be a factor, like, but nothing that looked at it directly, right? Like there was some papers that looked at like how accurately people perceived their 1RM, essentially. Like they were just rating their RIR after singles, working up to a 1RM, right? So people who were more experienced tended to be able to judge maximal effort a little bit better, and their RIR and their velocity of each rep was a little bit more tightly correlated. So I'm like, okay, that's something. There was a study from James Steele's lab, who I'm sure you have heard of, have some familiarity with him, that they did. It was different though, right? Like they had people, they would take an exercise that they're used to doing, a weight that they're used to using in their own training, and they were like, okay, before you do this set, how many reps do you think you can do to failure? And then they would do it, and they assess their accuracy that way. So it wasn't like intraset RIR accuracy. It was a little bit different. But still, they found people, I think it was greater than 3 years of experience. People tended to be more accurate compared to people with like less than 6 months of experience. So again, that was something. And I was like, all right. And the meta-analysis wasn't done at this point either. There's since been from Halperin et al., there's a meta-analysis on this whole, they did a bunch of different meta-regressions on all these different potential, sets, repetition range, all that kind of stuff, actual proximity to failure. And they also found training experience didn't seem to impact it. So it seems like it's not really a thing, but my gut feeling is that there's something we haven't quite done in the research yet. Just because like it's such a consistent observation in the field that there has to be something there. We just haven't been able to capture it yet with the study design. So maybe someday. But yeah, those are really the main things that I did not anticipate, but that's research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it definitely, I would say, I mean, a lot of people that come to coaching with us for Revive Stronger, they usually have a bit more training experience. So I don't get a ton of clients that like are brand new, but I would say when comparing someone that is maybe like a year in to someone that's been training like for a decade, both of them are probably pretty similar at gauging RIR. But if I think about like my girlfriend who barely trades at all, if she tried to do RIR, I don't think she would do great at it. Maybe I'm just not giving her much credit. Hopefully she doesn't listen to this. But so yeah, that would be my like observational experience. And then also like you mentioned with the different exercises. So like I know several clients that for whatever reason, when they're doing a back movement, they just have a really hard time gauging reps in reserve. Yeah. Same thing with something like a lunge or a squat. And I think maybe partially explained by like a lot of people with their back, they have a hard time getting a mind muscle connection with that kind of movement anyway. So it's kind of tricky for them. And then with lunges, there's like this big cardiovascular component as well. So they're like,
Yes,
yeah, I could kind of do another one, but there's a lot kind of going on here. So
for sure.
super interesting there. And I think that a lot of what you found was different to my observations, but hey, that's why you do the research,
Why we do it. I'm glad you brought up mind muscle connection too, because I think that's connected somehow. That's that thing is it's so hard to research, man. There's been a couple studies, but like it's just such an interesting thing. And I do think it's connected to this insofar as like your relationship with your body and like how in tune you are with your body, like that interoception, if you will, right? Like that that's what this is. Like obviously, as you're trained, it becomes informed by your prior training experience and whatnot, but just feeling, how your muscle is fatiguing and like all that kind of thing. It's tied together somehow. I don't know how, but there's something there. And I do think eventually we'll, in practice, we understand it well enough to make it work, right? It's just in terms of actually getting a paper where it's written down in words, we'll get there at some point. I don't know when it'll be, but
Yep, totally. And I guess one thought that I had while you're kind of going through the results there are, as they're kind of calling out these numbers, do you think any aspect of their improved accuracy was just related to like, well, I said it was 5, so like cognitive dissonance would tell me that the next rep is 4 and then 3. And then, they just kind of expect their reps in reserve to go down and they almost just like fail out of this is what I said, so now I'm going to fail here. Do you think any of that played a role, or what do you kind of think about that?
yeah. So I do think that it was different based on the person, right? Like some people you could tell that they like they'd say 5 and they do another one and it was like it moved faster, it looked easier, and they'd kind of give me this like 5, like they were confused.
Yeah.
So I don't think it happened a ton that people were like necessarily expecting it to go, the number to go down every time. That I did, if I saw that happen on a set, which certainly did happen every once in a while, right? That I would be like, hey, like just explaining to them, like, I can see that you're kind of doing this. Just make sure every rep you're treating independently as best you can, right? And just trying to give me your honest rating on each individual rep. But it's hard to get away from that, right? And part of that is I think a strength of the design that each prediction is sort of informed by the previous predictions, because that's what we do in the gym, right? So that was some of that was by design, but some of it also makes it a little bit more difficult. With the statistics we had to do, just to try to account for that somehow, and trying to, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I guess one good thing, we had 58 subjects, 4 sets per exercise, 3 exercises. So we have a lot of data. So that helps a lot of that kind of smooth out. But you're right. That is a limitation of it, right? That, some people may have had some sort of expectation and maybe paced themselves a little bit, or, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way that I said 0 R on that last one. I don't want to be wrong. And then they, so
Yeah.
I don't think that happened a ton, but I think it would be foolish to say it didn't happen at all, right? It probably did happen some.
Yeah. And I think it would be, somewhat obvious if like you had an individual in which like every time they just went 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 failure. Yeah. And, you'd probably be able to notice in the rep speed, the level of just like their perceived effort, like, when they finished the set, did it actually look like it challenged them? So I feel like you could probably pick up on those things and get a decent idea of that. And,
sure.
Like you said, even with myself, when I'm doing like a squat and, say last week I did, 225 for 10 at 3 reps in reserve, it's kind of like in my head, I've pre-programmed what I should be able to do this week at 1 reps in reserve. And often I really have to like train myself to like treat, like you said, every rep as an individual rep.
Yeah.
Just focus on, once you get towards later in the end of those reps, still try to keep that rep speed as high as you can. Almost like, still, if you're training based on reps in reserve, you still have that in your head, but still try to keep that rep speed towards the end of a rep.
For sure. It's like almost like not letting that RIR define the endpoint weirdly, right? Like it sort of is, but it's like letting it come to you rather than like,
exactly,
having it define it. So,
yep. Try to maintain that rep speed as much as possible, but let that reps in reserve comes to you. I think that's a really good way to kind of think about it. So kind of with that, what would be maybe just a few kind of practical takeaways that, either a coach or someone doing their own training, maybe they're using reps in reserve. Is there any kind of practical takeaways that you think that they can kind of take from this?
I think this gives us even more confidence that most people can use this system pretty well. And I think, one point, with the no differences based on training experience thing, it seems like some people are kind of interpreting this as like, then why would we even use this? If we don't get better at rating with experience, what's the point? Just go to failure or just whatever. And like, I kind of think it's the opposite, like it means everyone's accurate. So it's a good system for, it's not a perfect system by any means. Like there's absolutely individual variation, and some people just aren't super accurate. Some people are. So I think it's a really good system in general. And then obviously you need to individualize from there. But I think that's definitely one thing of trying to interpret that finding a little bit more. I don't want to say better, but maybe a little bit more fairly based on the data. I mean, we just, because this isn't the only study that's found that finding now, and the accuracy is generally not perfect, but good enough, right? Like in practice, we don't have to be perfect, right? If you're aiming for 2 RIR and you stop at 3 on accident, like, are you just not going to grow? No, right? So as long as we're close enough, it's good. So I think that's one big thing. And then the second one that was an interesting thing with this like initial guess thing that we did was that people, when they first felt they had 5 RIR, they were not very accurate, right? Like I think the mean, so how that was calculated was they did 4 sets per exercise, right? So we took the initial guess for each set of each exercise and average all that together for that subject. And then we could, we had that metric for each subject. And the mean was like 6.5 reps that they were off, right? So they were trying, if I said stop at 5 RIR, they actually would have stopped at like 11 or 12 RIR. That one, maybe we don't grow as much, right? So in that sense, I'm like, okay, asking somebody to stop at 5 RIR is maybe less recommendable. Maybe and the accuracy got way better, right? Once we get into like 4 or 3, et cetera, right? So I'm like, okay, well, maybe the highest RIR that I specifically programmed somebody is maybe 3 or 4 or something. Some of this too gets impacted by the rep range. So like the heavier the load is, the less reps you're doing per set. In general, the higher accuracy is. So maybe if we're doing sets of 8, you could probably stop at 4 or 5 RIR and be at least closer, right? Compared to sets of 15 or whatever. But anyway, so I think that's one thing. And then, but I don't want to say that sets further from failure should not be done. I mean, they're still useful in some circumstances, especially for strength. You can keep velocity nice and high, but for hypertrophy, I think, deloads, maybe an easy session in the middle of the week to, manage fatigue a little bit better or whatever. And, in that sense, maybe we just look at prior training data and say, okay, rather than saying, do this, this rep range at this RIR, we say, do this many reps with this weight that we know based on that prior data will land us around that RIR. So I think that's probably the best like programming thing that I can pull from this. But, yeah, I mean, it's, I think those are useful, right? Like they're not life-changing things, but hopefully it's at least a little bit helpful for somebody, right?
Absolutely. I think that those are definitely a couple of takeaways I had as well, in which you don't have to be necessarily an advanced trainee to use reps in reserve effectively. Like a lot of people, even kind of newer trainees, can at least get in the ballpark. And then, as you mentioned, a really good takeaway there is, probably using reps in reserve, there's probably some point of reps in reserve in which it doesn't become as effective. So like above about, 5+ reps in reserve, especially on maybe more hypertrophy rep ranges, that probably becomes a little bit less effective and a little bit less accurate. But I would say, like, for my own programming, often weeks 1 and 2 are like 3 to 4 reps in reserve, like a range. And then weeks 3 and 4 might be 1 to 2, week 5, 0 reps in reserve, and then deload. And in that deload, they have all of this training data to kind of decide, okay, well, if I program 5 reps in reserve here, they kind of get a feel for, okay, well, if I did 3 reps in reserve here in week 1, it's probably going to be ballpark right here. So I think that those are some really good takeaways there. So I think with that, Jake, I think here's a good place to wrap it. If people want to stay up to date on what you're doing, any other studies or research or content you're producing, where can people kind of go to follow you?
Yeah, I guess probably Instagram's the main thing. Like most people, right? It's just Jake dot data driven strength. That's like our coaching company. So all the coaching stuff, we do some educational content stuff. We have a nutrition course that's out. That's really cool. All that stuff's link in bio, that whole thing, right? But yeah, I mean, there's that, and then I guess as we have more and more research coming out of the lab, we always try to post about it and get it out there to people as soon as we can. So we got some exciting stuff. Some of it's going to be soon, some of it's going to be a couple of years probably, but it's going to be cool, man. We got some fun projects.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Jake. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.